They called it the ice trap, a vertical coffin, a monument to one man's madness. When Elias Thorne began hauling massive translucent blocks of lake ice into the heart of the Alaskan wilderness, his neighbors in the town of Oakhaven didn't just laugh. They placed bets on which night he'd freeze to death. To the local contractors, he was a fool. To the survival experts, he was a suicide case. He was a 62-year-old widower with a bad hip and a worthless plot of permafrost. They saw a man building a house of glass in a land of hammers. But Elias knew something the experts didn't. He knew that the most dangerous thing in the Arctic isn't the cold, it's the wind. And he knew that sometimes, to survive the ice, you have to become a part of it. The laughter stopped on January 14th, the day the Great North Ghost arrived. A polar vortex so violent it shattered steel pipes and turned car engines into useless blocks of iron. While the multi-million-dollar smart homes of Oakhaven were failing and the screams for help were muffled by 100 inches of snow, Elias Thorne was sitting in his ice trap in a t-shirt, sipping hot tea. There's an unspoken rule up in the mountains that no matter who you are, friend, bitter rival, stranger, anyone, if you're ever in a pinch and come across another hunter's cabin, you're welcome to seek shelter there. Maybe it's unspoken because it's common courtesy and that whole do unto others thing. Or maybe it's unspoken because there's hardly anyone to speak to. In the winter months especially, you'd be hard-pressed to see another soul for weeks, sometimes months. But that's the rule. You need it, you use it. No judgment, no questions asked. Just don't steal anything. This isn't just a story about a cabin. It's a story about the secret physics of the ancients, and the night the crazy old man became the only person in the valley who could feel his fingers. Elias Thorne wasn't a rich man. He was a retired thermal engineer who had spent 40 years studying how heat moves, or more importantly, how it stays still. When he lost his wife, Martha, he didn't want a condo in Florida. He wanted the silence of the North. He bought 40 acres of land that no one wanted. It was a sinkhole plot, a natural depression in the valley where the cold air settled and stayed. He began his project in late autumn, but he didn't bring in lumber trucks. He didn't bring in insulation foam. He brought a chainsaw and a sled to the frozen edge of Blackwood Lake. He began harvesting dead ice, thick, oxygen-free blocks from the deepest part of the lake. The mockery started almost immediately. "Hey, Elias," a local hunter, Miller, shouted from his heated Ford F-150. "You building a house or an oversized ice cube tray? You're gonna melt the moment you light a match." The town council tried to halt construction. They called it a structural hazard. They told him a house made of ice and earth couldn't possibly meet code. But Elias just showed them the deed and his permit for a temporary hunting shelter. He spent 16 hours a day in the fading light. He was an underdog with a deadline. He wasn't just building a home, he was building a masterpiece of thermodynamics that looked like a disaster to the untrained eye. The hidden genius. To understand why the ice trap worked, you have to unlearn everything you know about warmth. Most people think of ice as cold. Elias saw ice as a stabilizer. His design was based on a forgotten Inuit principle combined with modern fluid dynamics. He called it the phase shift envelope. First, he dug 6 feet down into the permafrost. This was the cold well. He knew that cold air is heavy, it sinks. By creating a sunken entryway lower than the living floor, he trapped the heaviest, deadliest air in a trench before it could ever reach his bed. Then came the walls. These weren't just ice blocks, they were a sandwich of materials. 12 inches of high-density lake ice. This acted as a windbreak that literally could not be breached by gusts. A 2-inch dead air space filled with dried lichen and willow bark, nature's fiberglass. An inner wall of rammed earth and stone. But the secret sauce? It was the thermal mass chimney. In the center of the cabin sat a massive 3-ton pillar of basalt rock. Elias spent his meager savings having these stones hauled in. This wasn't just a fireplace, it was a battery. Elias used a principle called thermal inertia. By burning a small, intense fire for just 2 hours, the basalt stones would soak up the BTUs. Because the ice walls on the outside kept the external temperature at a constant 32 degrees, no matter how much colder it got outside, the 3-ton pillar of stone would slowly radiate heat for the next 20 hours. To the neighbors, it looked like he was living in a freezer. In reality, Elias had created a pressurized vacuum of warmth. He was using the very coldness of the Arctic to seal his home airtight. The ice didn't melt because the inner walls stayed dry and the outer walls stayed rock hard.
By December, the ice trap was complete. It looked like a jagged blue cyst rising out of the snow. The town of Oak Haven was preparing for Christmas. They boasted about their triple-paned windows and their high-efficiency propane furnaces. Miller, the hunter, had just finished a $100,000 renovation on his mountain mansion. "Elias is gonna be a popsicle by New Year's," they joked at the local diner. The weather reports started getting nervous. The meteorologists weren't using words like storm anymore. They were using words like atmospheric collapse. A pressure system from the North Pole was sliding south, a polar finger of air so cold it had survived the descent from the upper atmosphere without warming. The warming went out. Stay indoors. Propane can gel at these temperatures. Power grids are at risk of brittle failure. Elias heard the news on his battery-operated radio. He didn't panic. He went down to his cold well, checked his seals, and stoked his basalt pillar one last time. He brought his dog, a scruffy husky named Barnaby, inside. He closed the heavy, insulated hatch. Outside, the sky turned a bruised, sickly purple. The wind died down to a terrifying, absolute silence. The world was holding its breath. The catastrophe. It hit at 3 a.m. The temperature didn't drop, it plummeted. It went from -10 to -50 in the span of an hour. In Oak Haven, the smart homes began to scream. Modern technology is built on the assumption of averages, but -50 is not an average. At Miller's mansion, the propane regulator froze solid, the furnace cut out. Within 30 minutes, the temperature inside his $100,000 home was 15 degrees. His pipes began to burst with the sound of gunshots, spraying water that turned to jagged spears of ice instantly. The power lines, weighted down by frost and hammered by 80-mile-an-hour gusts, snapped like dry twigs. The town went dark. But at the ice trap, the wind howled, trying to find a crack, a seam, a weakness. But Elias's cabin was a single monolithic shell. The ice blocks had centered, frozen together into a seamless, diamond-hard shield. Inside, it was silent. Elias watched a candle flame. It didn't even flicker. The thermometer on his basalt pillar read a steady glowing 68 degrees. While the world outside was shattering, Elias was wearing a flannel shirt, reading a book by the light of a single lantern. The ice trap wasn't a coffin, it was a womb. The very snow that buried the house acted as additional insulation. By morning, the cabin was completely covered in a 10-foot drift. To anyone outside, Elias was gone, buried alive. But under the snow, the thermal mass was doing its job. The heat from the stones was keeping the air breathable and warm. Elias and Barnaby slept through the worst storm in a century.
The aftermath and vindication. 3 days later, the National Guard plowed through to Oak Haven. It was a disaster zone. People were being treated for stage 3 frostbite in their own living rooms. Miller had lost everything. His home was a hollowed-out shell of burst pipes and moldy drywall. "What about the old man?" someone asked. "What about Thorne?" The rescue team took a snowmobile out to the sinkhole plot. All they saw was a white mound. No smoke, no movement. The commander sighed. "Get the shovels. Let's recover the body." They dug for 20 minutes. Suddenly, a shovel hit something hard, translucent, blue. A hatch swung open from the inside. A puff of steam, warm, moist, and smelling of cedar and tea, billowed out into the freezing air. Elias Thorne stepped out, blinking against the bright sun. He wasn't shivering. He wasn't pale. He looked better than he had in years. "Morning, boys," Elias said, patting his dog. "You guys look cold. Want some coffee?" The silence from the rescue team was the loudest thing in the valley. The experts, the contractors, the mockers, they stood on top of a masterpiece they didn't have the vision to understand. Elias Thorne didn't have money, and he didn't have modern tech. He had the wisdom of the earth. He understood that the greatest strength isn't found in fighting nature, but in moving with it. Elias still lives in that cabin. They don't call it the ice trap anymore. They call it the Diamond of the North. In a world obsessed with the newest and the loudest, sometimes the old ways, the quiet ways, are the only ones that stand the test of the storm. If you found Elias's story inspiring, hit that like button. It helps us find more stories of underdog genius. If you had to survive a -50-degree blast, would you trust a modern smart home or Elias's ice trap? Let us know why in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more secret architectural marvels. Stay warm out there.